Good evening, everyone. I'm Jim Mallinson, Chair of the Centre for Yoga Studies. Thank you very much, Theo, for setting all this up. And it gives me great pleasure this evening, or this morning for Dominic, for Professor Dominic Steavu, to introduce him as our speaker this evening. I don't think we've ever actually met, but we've been in touch quite a lot over the years. Dominic very kindly gave an excellent presentation at one of our Hatha Yoga Project workshops, which was organised by Mark Singleton and Daniela Bevilacqua, about physical practices that may have influenced the history of yoga. And so that's where our connection first appeared and our interests. And then, but unfortunately, Dominic couldn't make it for that in the end. And you gave your talk on Zoom, but I think that was pre-pandemic, so you were sort of ahead of the curve there. And then we tried to set this one up in person as well, but that didn't work out. So maybe third time lucky. We'll have to get you back another time and make it happen. But anyway, Professor Steavu is Associate Professor of Chinese Religions and Chinese Buddhism at the University of California in Santa Barbara, and his research focuses on medieval Daoism and Buddhism, especially as regards therapeutic and or contemplative bodily practices. And so there's that, which is obviously of interest, great interest in itself, but he's also interested in the transcultural circulation of ideas relative to those practices, which is, of course, how we first started discussing, because in recent work of mine, which I'm obviously not the first to discover it, people have looked into this much over the years, over the decades. There's been a lot of talk about interplay between Chinese body practices and Indian body practices. There's a lot more work to be done, but I think we're beginning to make a bit of ground here. And so and Professor Steavu has looked into their reception history as well throughout Asia and beyond. And now I shall just hand over to Professor Steavu, who's going to be talking to us about the Daoist body. And of course, we'll have questions at the end on, put questions on Slido if you've got any, please. Okay, over to you, Dominic. Thanks very much.
All right, well, thank you very much, Jim, for this introduction. And I want to thank the SOAS Center of Yoga Studies, along with Professor Jim Mallison and Theo Wildcroft and Erica Morton-McGill as well, for organizing this, for inviting me, for putting it together, and giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts. I want to preface this by saying that I don't have any formal training in yoga studies, and I'm a bit of a neophyte when it comes to South Asian traditions. So this presentation will mainly focus on China. I will make occasional oblique references to the little that I know about South Asian traditions as well, and hopefully that will be sufficient to get some conversation going. But I realize also that I have to speak to my audience, and so this talk will not be a kind of traditional research presentation. It's going to be an overview of some of the work that has already been done on the Daoist body by others and myself included. And I'll just try to share my thoughts and present those notions about the Daoist body as clearly as possible. So thank you all for being here and for listening. Get started here. Okay. So just a little kind of very brief definition, if you will, of what Daoism is. It's a collection of very heterogeneous traditions that are lumped together, sometimes artificially, by scholars, and not only modern scholars, but scholars throughout the history of Daoism in China as well. And it combines perspectives and practices from medicine, therapy or health, philosophy, politics and statecraft, chemistry as well, psychology, cosmology, astronomy, divination, and also what we in academia, I guess, would call religion. And it organizes all these very disparate things into a coherent worldview. It emerges around 300 BCE in China at the intersection of political philosophy, quietist self-cultivation, as well as, very importantly, longevity and immortality cults. And this latter component, I guess, of the genesis of Daoism focuses on preserving the material body. And this will be a kind of theme that runs through some of the materials that I'll be presenting today. So there isn't, initially at least, no effort or impetus to transcend the body or access some kind of higher spiritual form of incarnation or what have you. Daoism becomes institutionalized, so it becomes, I guess, conscious of its unity despite this heterogeneity as a tradition in 142 CE with the rise of the celestial masters. And we have a very formative period between 142 CE and around the end of the 900s, where all of the critical texts and major views and practices are developed. And by the 12th century already, a lot of it has been ossified or established. There's still innovations, obviously, between the 12th century and today, but not at the rate that we have between the 100s and the 900s. So that really forms that period, it constitutes the bedrock of Daoist thought and practice. Now, despite its heterogeneity throughout its over 2,000-year-old history, Daoism has relied on a set of metaphors consistently in talking about the body. And there are quite a few. Here today, we're going to focus on the major ones. And there are three of them. The first one is the body as a cosmos, as a microcosm, and kind of small scale representation or duplication of the cosmos. The other one is the body as an inhabited landscape. Here too, you have this notion of a microcosm that emerges. And lastly, this view combines elements from the preceding two, the body as a generative matrix. These are more or less chronological. So the first one, body as a cosmos, I guess would be dominant in the early period of the development of Daoism, between 300 before the Common Era and 200 of the Common Era. The second one, inhabited landscape, is dominant during the early medieval period between 200 and 600. And the third, the body as a generative matrix, arises in the medieval period around actually 700, 800, drawing on early materials. And then it continues on as the dominant way of talking about the body up until today, basically, in Daoism. So this is the one that kind of won out, if you want to look at it that way. Each mode of or model of the body here is associated with its own set of practices as well. And we're going to be looking at those. So obviously what I'll be presenting here is not, it's not all my material. The Daoist body has been studied, amply studied in the past. I guess Maspero would have been earlier than Rick Schipper here, but the, I guess, fundamental or earliest book that is specifically on the topic of the Daoist body is by Rick Schipper, came out in the 90s. And then Catherine Despeux has worked on it as well, on this theme of the Daoist body. As you can see here, this book was recently, I guess 3-4 years ago, translated into English, in case you're curious. So these are sources that you can follow up on. They're fairly accessible, and they're not too daunting either in terms of being overly technical or what have you. Fabrizio Pregadillo has also recently been publishing. He doesn't have a book, but he's been publishing articles that have been very, I guess, formative, at least in my view of the Daoist body, or my understanding of it. And these you can look up online. They're easy to find through academia.edu. If you want to access them and you can't find them, you can send me an email and I'll give you the full bibliographic reference. So the alchemical body in Daoism and which is the Daoist immortal body, these are the two main articles by Fabrizio Pregadio on the topic. I've also written a bit about it in this volume that I co-edited, Embryological Discourse and Sexual or Reproductive Imagery in East Asian Religions. I have a chapter in there that addresses some of these issues related to the Taoist body, and a chapter as well in my book that came out a couple of years ago. So what I hope is that, with a kind of reconsideration of this material or a fresh look at it, and by keeping in mind its potential connections with yogic practices, we can open up new fields of inquiry. So that would be kind of the point of today's talk. Just a quick overview. We're going to focus, each section is going to focus on one of these models of the body, and then we'll have some concluding thoughts. So it's fairly straightforward, and we can jump right into it. The earliest one, as I mentioned, is this view of the body as a cosmos. So it is in early materials represented as a site that is animated by cosmological principles, elements, powers, energies, and processes. This is kind of important as well. So everything is in constant transformation and in flux. They're not static. This view is rooted in what we could call pre or at least para Daoist medical understandings of the body as a microcosm. So it's not specific to Daoism. Daoism is, I guess it borrows this model and elaborates on it in this early formative period. And some of these, its constitutive elements for this metaphor of the body are qi, which is considered a kind of vital breath that permeates the universe. And this is obviously what animates us as people as well, as humans. And here you see I'm doing a little pointy finger thing at the notion of prana, which is more or less, from my understanding at least, a parallel idea. Yin and yang, of course, also are reproduced in the body, and these are important cosmic elements. This basic binary or male and female principles, the 8 trigrams, which are sequential markers or symbols that mark processes or the passage of time, I guess, in one way or another. They're associated with changes and mutations and things like that. The 5 agents, sometimes mislabeled as the 5 elements, but these are active agents, so we call them agents: metal, fire, water, soil, and wood. These are all represented in the body. And again, I want to stress this notion of the body as, or at least these energies as being dynamic and in flux and transformative. And there's always an effort to find a balance between all of them. Now, while these are abstract renderings, right? So people don't actually have trigrams in their body. They rely on what is understood to be a very physical and concrete framework in Daoism and Chinese medicine for that matter. The basic internal organs, so known as the 5 viscera, and the digestive organs are known as the 6 receptacles. These store and process vital cosmic energies, turning them into vitality or qi, or refining them into increasingly higher energies. And this is part of a larger correlative cosmology that regrettably I don't have that much time to get into, but all of these are interconnected. So you have the 5 viscera that are connected to the lesser digestive organs, the 6 receptacles that are connected to the 5 agents, that are connected to sensory organs, that are connected to seasons, to tastes, to times, to directions. And here you see another illustration of this. And all of these have to be always balanced, and depending on the time of year or the activity or the place that you are or what you're eating, you also have to keep in mind those correspondences and associations so as to not generate an imbalance. For example, to give you a very straightforward kind of illustration at this point, if it's really hot, as it sometimes is in the summer, heat and summer are associated with yang energy. And therefore you shouldn't be eating rooster meat, which is highly yang as well, because then you're going to overpower the yin energies in your body, and that will cause damage to certain organs that are associated with yin or yang, and so on and so forth. So this is just like a very simplified view of how the system works. We also have meridians and channels that circulate these energies after they're stored, processed. And this notion of the three cinnabar fields as three centers, energetic centers of the subtle body that are also, despite being non-physiological, so you can't identify them when you dissect the body, but they are believed to be very present and real and quote unquote material. These are centers where these energies and vital breath are refined. So they're pretty akin to chakras, and from what I understand also, early chakra systems had fewer chakras, 3 or 4, which more or less aligns with this. And there's a lot of focus in the Chinese tradition and the Daoist tradition on the lower cinnabar field, which is where the essence, vidya, is generated. And then you have to bring it up and refine it in the middle cinnabar field, which is associated usually with the heart. The lower cinnabar field is in the kind of lower abdomen. So sometimes it's described as being 3 inches below the navel, between the kidneys. Yeah, essentially. And then you refine that energy in the middle cinnabar field where it becomes vital breath. And then you refine it a second time in the brain area in the upper cinnabar field, where it becomes spirit. So you have this progression, this refinement. And this focus, initial focus on the lower cinnabar field, as I understand, is kind of analogous to certain emphases that we have in chakra systems, perhaps. So under this model, this first model of body as cosmos, practices are usually geared towards correcting imbalances in order to optimize health and longevity. So the focus is on preserving the body and its health, again, not transcending it, counteracting its corruption and the imbalances that occur. And these practices are typically part of a system, I guess, that can be called nourishing life. Now, this system is made up of a variety of different practices. It depends on the source. Usually there's about 4 to 6 of them that are identified. Ingestion of medicines or elixirs is one of them. The second is dietetics, a second common one. In Chinese, these characters mean avoiding grains. And that refers to basically, I mean, grains are a placeholder for any food that is processed, that is not found or consumed in its natural state. So grains, obviously you have to like remove the husk and dry them out, and then you cook them and so on and so forth. It involves a lot of processing. So this becomes representative of all foods that are processed. So ideally, he would be eating, according to Daoists, macrobiotically or raw foods as they are in nature. The third one that consistently shows up in these lists of nourishing life practices are postural forms of self-cultivation. You have an illustration here of some of them. In this version, they're seated. Later on, they become or can become more dynamic, I guess. And the Chinese term for this is Daoyin, which means guiding and stretching, or guiding and pulling. That could refer either to, stretching the body, the limbs, and guiding it through various postures, or it could refer perhaps more probably to guiding and expanding or stretching this vital breath, this qi, while you do these movements. So in the descriptions of the postures in Chinese sources, right, obviously this is analogous to this notion of asanas. So in the descriptions in Chinese sources, these postures are very often combined with breathing exercises. So you have a close connection between breath control and postural self-cultivation. And I understand that it's also quite similar in yogic sources with this pairing of asanas and pranayama, right? These breath control practices. In Chinese, the characters mean to circulate qi, or circulate vital breath, or to ingest vital breath. So that kind of illustrates things a bit. And lastly, sexual practices are also associated with these nourishing life practices that are typically representative of this first way of viewing the body as a cosmos. And I guess we can spend a bit of time on sexual practices, right? Yeah, we're about 13 minutes in or so. The basic principle of these early sexual practices is to take vitality, to take yang energy, which represents vitality, from your partner, without at the same time losing your own. So only one person reaches climax, and it shouldn't be you. It should be the other person. It can work either way, male or female, or male, female. There's no importance attributed to that. But there's two people usually, and one of them is trying to, I guess it's been described as vampirize the other's vital energy. And what you do with your own is usually instead of emitting it during climax, and again, this goes for men or women, you return it up the spinal column and refine it in the cinnabar field, the middle one, and eventually return it to the brain in order to fortify it. And this affords longevity, it affords like clarity of spirit, and a bunch of other advantages. And this is, again, from my limited understanding, similar to Vajroli Mudra practices. And let me show you the text before I get into what essence means. So this is for men, a practice that is, you have practices for women as well, but this is a practice for men. And it says, as for the way of returning essence to supplement the brain, when one is engaged in intercourse, one's essence is greatly stirred and desires to come out. So the essence wants to come out, emissions. One should quickly, by means of the two main fingers of the left hand press down behind the yin satchel, as it is called, and in front of the great cave. So during this great undertaking, while pressing down, one should draw in a long breath. So again, this notion of breath control here, and then resume breathing normally without ceasing. Concurrently, click the teeth several dozen times. So this is either to scare away negative influences or to summon the gods of the body. You just click your teeth. And then when one releases the essence will actually not come out. Rather, from the jade stalk, it will return upward, entering the brain. So this is the basic technique. Essence here refers to semen for men, and ejaculate for women. In some cases, it's described as menses for women, but this is the kind of literal take on it. Sometimes it's described a bit more metaphorically, and essence is this vital energy in very coarse form, unrefined form, before it becomes the qi, before it becomes vital breath. This is another passage that I don't have the time to go through, but you can go back to the recording and pause it if you want to read it. But in the interest of time, we'll skip ahead. Again, in these practices, all of them, not only sexual practices, but all of these nourishing life practices that are connected to this vision of the body as a cosmos, the focus is on preserving the body and its health. Now, the second metaphor, body as landscape, comes to the forefront, I guess, of practices a bit later, during the early medieval period. And here you have this, it's not only a landscape, a natural landscape, it's an integrated landscape that features inhabitants as well. And sometimes it also features palaces or pavilions and things that are usually associated not necessarily with religious traditions, but more with statecraft. So in the Tao's perfect order, the natural order of things, you have a perfect integration with human societies and nature. And this is represented in this vision of the body as a landscape. So it's not just a mountain with animals and no humans. You have buildings and infrastructure and bridges and things like that. So in Taoist utopias, both the natural and the human worlds are perfectly integrated. And so the body becomes a kind of utopia in this mode of representation. It is an image of the Tao's perfect order. Now that image that I just showed didn't look too much like a body, it just looked like a mountain. And it was hard to make out, but I have another clearer image where this will become a bit less confusing. So imagery related to mountains, obviously, sometimes water, and to statecraft are most prominent under this model. So again, we have these two. The top text, I guess, or excerpt or passage focuses more on the natural elements. So you have heaven, you have the seasons. It's kind of covered by my face there, but sun and moon are the eyes. Hair is stars and constellations, and you have a mountain and a flowery canopy as well. And in this other description, like I said, it's more infrastructural, or it has to do more with urbanization or urban planning. So the chest and the belly are like the ruler's palace. The four limbs are like the suburbs and borders or frontiers. Bones and joints are like the 100 officials. The spirit is like the ruler, blood is like the ministers, and breath, vital breath, is like the people. Therefore, if one is able to govern oneself, one can govern a country. Being fond of the people is the way to make one's country secure. Preserving one's breath is the way to keep one's person whole. When the people scatter, the country is lost. And when breath is exhausted, the person dies. So these are two different ways of seeing the body as a landscape, but sometimes these two ways of seeing or describing the body as a landscape are combined in one. Moreover, the landscape and cosmos models are not mutually exclusive. So the landscape model kind of builds on the model of the body as a cosmos, and there's a lot of overlap as well. So in this, it becomes a bit clearer. This is, again, a representation of the body as a landscape, and you have all of the major points that are identified. And here in green, it's not super visible, but in green, you have these trigrams that appear. So these are cosmic principles. And you have in kind of pinkish red, the 3 cinnabar fields as well, which were tied to this cosmic notion of chi, of vital breath or vital energy. So these get transferred over into this metaphor of the body as a landscape. So practices for this model are more focused on meditations and visualizations of the inner gods. So for the earlier model, you had a focus primarily on nourishing life. Here, the focus shifts to inner gods. And these are the gods who are believed to populate the inner landscape. Many of them appear as officials or as high-ranking ministers or members of this imperial bureaucracy. That's how they are represented. And this is not a closed system, so it's not a cosmic egg. We'll come to that idea later on. But so you have interactions between this inner landscape and things outside of it. In some cases, you have to feed these gods through meditations, energies from the sun or the moon or from the stars, and you collect them and then direct them towards wherever the gods are in your body at that time, in order to feed them with it, so that they're kept satiated and happy. This is another representation of what the gods might look like, the gods of the heart in this case. And I mean, it's hard to make out, the quality of the image isn't great, but they're dressed in official garb. So they're like officials and ministers. Let me just pull this out here so we can see the text a bit better. This is a typical meditation on the inner gods, what it would look like. So with one's hair untied, lying straight and supine, so on your back, outdoors, with one's eyes closed. So you could be sleeping, basically. This could be almost a sleeping meditation. Constantly meditate on the yellow essence of the moon and the scarlet vital breath of the sun from the two eyes, descending and entering the mouth. Swallow it. Do this 27 times, then stop. And this is basically what you're collecting these essences, and you're going to circulate them in your body to feed deities. And here we have a specific deity that we're talking about. Constantly meditate on a little lad inside your body wearing crimson vestments, residing in the center of your heart. When doing so, also visualize a crimson flowery canopy in your heart. Below is another person wearing a layered red headdress, a simple scarlet robe with an arrow in his mouth, drawing his bow. So they're very detailed descriptions of these gods, because you're supposed to be visualizing them, right? And the more information you have, the kind of easier it is to manifest them in your mind's eye. This second god is angrily wrathful and can protect against violent harm, or can summon gods and demons. Perhaps parallels to Yoga Nidra. Some people have made that point. I know Olivia Cohn has. At any rate, the result is longevity, again, focusing on the body, youth, health, protection from injury or untimely death, and communication. This is a kind of added bonus with the divine and unseen. A lot of these were used for the purpose of divination as well, where you would summon the gods, have a chat with them and ask them, how you'll do on your exam tomorrow, or what have you. So still, the material body is the primary site of the benefits of these practices here. And again, I want to stress this point that the models are not, I'm simplifying here, but they're not mutually exclusive, and they often have a lot of overlap and they build on each other. So this is just to give you a quick example. Am I doing on time? The gods of the five viscera can be represented in a number of ways. You actually see the viscera as they would appear materially or physiologically, right, with the kidneys, and the liver looks a bit different, but that was the understanding of what it looked like at the time. And then you have animal forms of their gods. You have anthropomorphic forms of their gods. Here they look like aristocrats for the most part, or royalty. You have those trigrams that are represented as well. And you have clouds of chi, of vital energy, which are a bit more abstract, but they have different colors depending on the viscous, depending on the organ. So this is an interesting image. And these models are avowedly metaphorical. So the texts state that this is not actually what the gods look like. It's just that this is how they manifest to us, or this is how, by visualizing them in this way, this is how we can summon them. So it's very straightforward and direct that these are images. These are second order representations of these energies, or of these gods, of these unseen subtle forces or processes that are at work in the material body. So the function of these images, these texts state, is to actually relate the unseen or the immaterial to the concrete and to the material, so that adepts have something to work with, right? Otherwise, it's kind of very abstract and very hard to wrap your mind around things and do things with those energies. So this is, I used a color version of this chart for the main image for the talk. This is a famous chart of the inner landscape. I'll go through it rather quickly because I don't want to go over time too much, but this is the kind of archetypal representation of the body as a living inhabited landscape that integrates both human and natural elements. And it's highly symbolic. So you have at the bottom there a boy and a girl on water wheels, and what they're doing there is inverting the stream, the normal stream where you lose your vital essence with it going downward, right? So they're inverting it and recirculating it upward, up the spine, as we'll see in a second, instead of losing it and dissipating it. And it passes through this kind of a barrier tower building, which is the first of three barriers located at the coccyx. And then that inverted energy flow or essence flow goes to heat the cauldron of the lower cinnabar field. And you have, I mean, you can see the fire right under the yin yang symbols, and there's a kind of plate under it. So that's the lower cinnabar field. Yin yang symbols represent the five agents, and the connection between them represents the fifth one. We also have an ox there and a farmer, and they are plowing to prepare the terrain in order to plant the seed of the golden elixir. So this is actually an alchemical representation of the body, which is closer, I guess, in spirit to the model of the body as a generative matrix, but we'll get to that in a minute. We have here in the middle part a spiral that seems to be surrounded by flames or water or something. And this is the middle cinnabar field located in the heart. Then we have a kind of child figure holding the Big Dipper or manipulating it. And this is Altair, the star. It's the cowherd, you know, that legend of the cowherd and the weaving maiden that join in the sky once a year, and for the rest of the year they can't see each other. We have the weaving maiden right below there, and they join their energies that both of them feed into the spine and move up the spine. We have the second of the barriers, which isn't that visible, but there's a little bridge looking thing right across from the heart, which is the second of these barriers. And then you have the 12-story pagoda, which is the trachea. And this is kind of like the beginning of the head area. You have the third gate, which is not really visible here. In the next slide, it will be the jade pillow at the level of the occiput, right? So the base of the skull, basically. This figure with the outstretched arms is Bodhidharma, a Buddhist figure, but especially from the medieval period onward, there's a lot of integration of Buddhist imagery, language, practices as well in Daoism, and especially in internal alchemy, which doesn't necessarily have to be classified as something Daoist. It's really at the intersection of Daoism and Buddhism, as well as Confucianism to a certain extent. Above him is Lao Tzu, the founder of Daoism, and then you have the two orbs that represent the sun and moon. These are the eyes, and the upper cinnabar field is basically that whole area that's made up of a building of raging waters and these peaks, emerging peaks. The upper cinnabar field is it has 9 distinct areas that are known as chambers, and that's what they're represented as here. So finally, we move to the last one, body as generative matrix. The third model is later, and it combines, again, a lot of elements from the previous two. It stresses, first of all, the body as a cosmic egg, right? So it's self-sufficient, it's sealed off, there's nothing outside of it. And at the same time, this cosmic egg is also a generative matrix because it produces everything that is inside of it. So these are characteristics that liken it to the Tao, which encompasses everything and generates all within it. But the Tao itself is outside, at the same time that it is inside of the universe and generates a universe, it is also outside of it. It is pre-cosmic. So if you think about it in terms of, I don't know, the Big Bang, for example, the Big Bang creates or generates the universe, and then the space in which the Big Bang occurs, in which that singularity departs from, is the Tao, right? So that's pre-cosmic or metacosmic, I guess. And we have, a few passages to illustrate this from the scripture on the way in virtue that liken the universe to being and the Tao to non-being. The Tao in the second one, this is a famous passage, cosmogony, basically, at the genesis of the cosmos, according to Daoists. The Tao generates unity, so it's this singular point where everything is contained, much like that singularity at the Big Bang, or 1 split second before the Big Bang. Unity generates duality, which is yin and yang. And then duality generates ternarity, or the three: heaven, earth, and humanity. So things kind of expand and develop. And then ternarity generates the 10,000 creatures, so all of creation. And we'll see that the main point of these practices associated with the body as a generative matrix is inverting this process that's described in this passage here. It's going backward from all of creation to 3 to 2, and then to 1, a point of unity, and then transcending that very point of unity to recommune, I guess, or rejoin the Tao. So I'll try to get that as quickly as possible since I'm running out of time. So this model, generative matrix model, is expressed through 2 discursive modes. The first one is, or submodels, I guess. The first one is the body as a reproductive site, in which an embryo is produced, or an infant. And this occurs already in the early medieval period in meditations on the inner gods, or bodily gods. We have descriptions of this infant or embryo that you can generate through meditation by joining different energies together. So here we see, for example, that you have this red child in your lower cinnabar field. And if you constantly meditate on a deity called the Supreme Unity, who is tied to this notion of cosmogonic unity, this deity constantly nourishing the perfected cinnabar child, then it will grow. And not only that, but the cinnabar child is actually, this is in the last line, your own self and your own original name or identity. Do not forget this. This will become important in a second. So this model of body as generative matrix is also connected to embryonic breathing methods, in which you are instructed to breathe like an embryo. So through your skin, through what would be the equivalent to an umbilical cord, so not through the lungs. And this practice generates actually a perfected version of yourself, an embryo. I don't have too much time to get into that, but this too, I think, has a few intersections with pranayana. You also have an early practice, again, a precursor to these models of body as generative matrix, in which you create a perfected version of yourself, and your imperfect carnal self is abandoned as a corpse. So this is known as corpse liberation or corpse deliverance techniques. It's also known as feigned death, and it's very useful. Like if you get captured and you're in prison, then you just abandon your carnal body. People think you're dead, and you've actually escaped in this ethereal body somewhere else. So you have precursors, is the point I was trying to make. The second way in which this model is expressed is the body as an alchemical crucible in which an elixir is produced. So you have a kind of parallel here between reproductive site, an infant or embryo, and alchemical crucible and elixir, right? The production of the elixir. And here in this image, you see very clearly the lower cinnabar field is an alchemical tripod. And then you have a vessel also in which it's refined at the level of the heart before circulating that essence back to the brain. So this is, of course, this imagery is derivative of laboratory alchemy, precursor to internal alchemy, much older. But there too, with laboratory alchemy, a lot of these processes were so complicated, the ingredients were very hard to come by, they were very expensive when they were available, that in all likelihood, a lot of these were practiced virtually, so to speak, so through meditations, right? So they were visualized, these alchemical processes were purely visualized. This is another chart of a famous chart of the body, primarily as an alchemical crucible in the center, which is where all the action happens. But you also have the three cinnabar fields. You have lunar phases, solar phases. You have trigrams. You have the embryo in the center, in the heart as well. And this is a somewhat clearer version. And this is the topic of Catherine Despeux's book. If you're interested in learning more about that, I referenced it earlier on. So you can go back and check out the title. So, right, these discursive models, the ones about, you know, the body as crucible and the body as reproductive site, come together in internal alchemy, also known as Neidan. And this is, it emerges around the 800s, and it's still part of Daoist practice nowadays, but I guess the formative period is 800 to the 1200s, and then you have a few important commentators since then that also contribute. But the idea behind it fundamentally is to produce something outside the body that was not there to begin with. And this is why I talk about the body as a generative matrix. And what you're producing is either this embryo or a golden elixir by inverting this cosmogonic process that I had on the other slide, and going back to unity and then the Tao. And by doing this, you're actually, the way that you go back is by generating this new version of yourself, a new body. So in this model, the present material body is to be discarded once this new body is created. Its preservation through longevity or immortality is not sought. Why? Because it is post-cosmic, right? It comes after the cosmos was created, and therefore it is essentially corrupt. So you want to get back to the quote unquote purity of pre-cosmic Tao. So the new body is a perfected body or true self. That's how it's described. Golden elixir is another name for one's fundamental nature. I have to skip through that, unfortunately, because I still want to spend a few minutes on the conclusion. And what happens is, after nourishing it for a 9-year period, so 9 years, once you create this perfected version of your body, it's in your body, you're nourishing it with essences and meditation practices, it's growing, and it reaches maturity, and then it has to come out. So the body, this perfected body, is delivered, usually from the top of the head. It emerges. Some people describe it as an actual birth through the top of the head, like the imagery of the cicada shedding its skin is often used, and it cracks open the skull, and it's very painful. But in most cases, this is understood as being an energetic process that doesn't have concrete physical consequences. But the identity of the adept basically is transferred to this new body that emerges from the old one. And at this point, so in the ultimate stage, after you've created this body and delivered it, with this new body, you rejoin the pre-cosmic original Tao. And this is variously described as emptiness, drawing on Buddhist discourse here, vacuity, non-existence or non-being. In some texts, even these dichotomies between existence and non-existence, or being and non-being, are transcended themselves, right? So you go even beyond that. And this true self provides the adept with access to the spaceless and timeless pre-cosmic Tao. Not only that, the body, this true self, is the spaceless and timeless pre-cosmic Tao. Okay. Conclusion. So where does this leave the material body? What is the material body? In certain Taoist practices, especially those that adopt, since the medieval period, this generative mode of representation, the body is merely a tool. It's a prop or a vector for self-cultivation. It is sometimes even, we get the impression that it's nothing more than a ritual object that is used in a ritual practice or a soteriological instrument in the pursuit of a real and perfected body, which is none other than the true self or the Tao. And I have this image here that'll, what it represents will become clear in a second. We have this, I haven't found Taoist texts that express this as clearly, but certain Buddhist texts do express this ambiguity between the body and ritual objects, and they actually instruct the practitioners to become ritual objects. So there's an example of one text in which the adept becomes a divination board. So these boards in which you have to manipulate, it's like it's hard to describe, but a square plate, and then there's a mobile round part, and you make it point in certain directions towards certain cosmological values. And the adept does this in the sacred space, so that the adept becomes him or herself the divination board. There's another very interesting example where adepts light an incense seal, which is represented here. This is the bija of Avalokiteshvara, of the goddess of, or the bodhisattva of compassion. And they have to imagine themselves becoming the seal, being consumed, and then turning into the smoke that also has the same shape as the seal. It's the seed syllable hri, the bija hri. And they identify with the smoke. So their body becomes the smoke, and then the smoke becomes the bodhisattva. And by doing that, then they identify with Avalokiteshvara. They become Avalokiteshvara. But still, there's this intermediate step of them becoming the incense seal and then the smoke, which is very interesting in terms of, what we're talking about, a body as a quite literally a ritual object. So ultimately, the body, although concrete, is not real. It is itself an image, just like the metaphors that Daoists use to talk about it. It is a simulacrum, a pale copy, or shadow. Sometimes this term is used to describe it, of what the true self is. So an imperfect expression of the essential ideal of a perfected body, right? So this, while I was writing this, it struck me as somehow Platonic. Yeah, that's not very important in this context. So what does this ideal true body look like? What is the perfected true body, right? Beyond these descriptions of it being the Tao. Well, we have some indications. I just have like 2-3 more slides, so please bear with me and then we'll be done. Some Taoist scriptures talk about a conventional appearance to gods versus, an esoteric appearance. So the way that they would manifest to low-level adepts versus the way that they manifest to higher level, more advanced adepts. And this is an example for from the 3 sovereigns, their conventional appearance, and then you have here their esoteric appearance. So it's a marked difference. But even these esoteric appearances are not the true selves. It's not their true bodies. So at another level, gods are described in terms of their true shape or their true form, which is a technical term that comes up a lot in Daoist texts. And here, when we have representations of this, they look more like shadows again, right? So you have here the shadow image of a god, and then on the right, the shadow image of, or the true shape image of 5 sacred peaks that you have in China. And when they talk about the true shape of a peak, they also talk at the same time of the true shape of the god of that peak, of that mountain. So they can be anthropomorphic shadows, abstract shapes, or even kind of like these labyrinthine, shadowy patterns that become very abstract. But this is supposed to be a truer representation of what deities actually look like in the divine realm, in the divine world. So these are, forms of one specific mountain, the central March Mount, and its god. According to some scriptures, there's even a purer form beyond this true shape, and it is closer to writing, which is an interesting concept. So this is known as true names that happen to be truer than, or more or less equivalent to true shape, but they are logographic. And this is no surprise, since the Chinese writing system is, for the Chinese historically, it was a marker of cultural distinction between themselves and others, mode of communication with the divine. So they communicated with the divine through writing by sending up petitions and talismans and things like that. It's also believed that your name, or even the way that you write certain characters, calligraphy, for example, is an expression of your vital breath, of your chi, of your spirit. So this importance that is associated between, that is attributed to writing and its connection to identity is not altogether surprising. You have here the 3 sovereigns. I showed you the esoteric forms and conventional forms. This is their written form. This is what they appear as in this kind of truer embodiment. So we can imagine an ultimate reality in Taoist terms that is entirely made up of logographs of divine writing, right, including its divine inhabitants. And it would look something like this, just like this kind of code with beings or anything, any constituent of that reality taking the form of this, this divine writing. So we can assume then that, if this is the true shape of deities, perhaps the true shapes of realized adepts is also somewhat similarly logographic. This is not described in any texts, however. And the way that texts describe, they don't really describe this ultimate true or perfect body, other than through a kind of via negativa discourse. So typically this body is everywhere and nowhere. It is before, now, and always. It is the great image without shape that transcends even the materia prima, even this earliest components of the universe. So it's ineffable and unfathomable. And I'm just going to end with 2 quick quotations from Liu Yiming, who was a later master of internal alchemy, but a very influential one. The coagulation of the elixir or the embryo or the true self occurs within empty non-being, and neither has anything to do with men or women, nor is concerned with the skin bag made of breath and matter. So it returns to the pre-cosmic creation and transformation, which is devoid of forms and images. It does not stick to being and does not sink into non-being. It has no form but can generate forms. It has no image but can generate images. Thank you very much for bearing with me through this kind of longish talk.
Thank you, Dominic. No, that was great. No, it's so rich and so many. I mean, there was plenty of peculiar things that were alien to me, but there are so many interesting parallels and interesting connections that I could pursue. We've got a few questions, but of course I'm going to use my chair's prerogative, and I've got about a dozen, but I'm not. I don't worry, everyone. I won't ask them all. And don't forget about Slido. If people do want to ask questions, should put the questions on Slido. I thought I'd ask, just start off with a sort of big question about. I was very interested, just your definition of Daoism at the beginning, of how it just covers so many different aspects of life, I suppose, and society and so forth. And that seems to map on quite nicely to the concept of Tantra, in fact, in Indian religion, which can cover so much. But that made me wonder about Daoism's place in society. How pervasive was it? How many people? And also, there are a couple of subtle clues from which I inferred that it is somewhat perhaps elitist, or to do with practiced by the elites. When you were talking about control of the breath in the body, enabling you to control the land and so forth, that read like a sort of political manual. So I was wondering if you could say something about Daoism's place in Chinese society, who was doing it, and how pervasive it was.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So when it starts off, two of the fundamental texts are somewhat concerned with, or I guess the first one, the Scripture of the Way and Virtue, is very concerned with statecraft, with politics, and it emerges in this period where you have roaming advisors, and everyone is kind of throwing their lot in and trying to gain these prestigious positions with warlords, or eventually the emperor. And Daoism is part of this. The second text, the Zhuangzi, Book of Master Zhuang, kind of turns its back on this and says, no, we can focus more. It's more of a quietist text. We can focus more on cultivating ourselves, and then everything else will fall into order. But from the beginning, Daoism is definitely involved or concerned about its reception by the elite. And when it becomes an institutional religion, it is definitely political. It's always trying to include itself in political debates and discourse, and it does so quite successfully. And for most of its history, or at least during the medieval period, you have a back and forth between emperors supporting Daoism as the main official religion, and that comes with tax breaks. It comes with donated land. It comes with a huge amount of benefits. So either Daoism or Buddhism. And you have, at the high level, you have court debates. You have a lot of animosity between Daoists and Buddhists. So that's the elite level. So it's a very self-conscious tradition. It wants to build itself as something in contradistinction to Buddhism for much of its history. At the level of common or popular practice, those differences kind of dissipate. And what happens is that you have, I guess, the lower you go and the less literate population is, you have people practicing around certain masters or gurus. And those masters will take from a variety of sources. They are typically literate, and they'll take practices from Daoism, from Buddhism, and it doesn't matter. And therefore, the majority of practitioners, I think, in terms of absolute numbers at least, were not concerned with the difference between Buddhism or Daoism at all. Or even if it was like a local popular tradition that wasn't derivative of an institutional religion, they would practice that too and lump it all together. So To answer your question, Daoism is very present at the level of ruling elites. The textual tradition is mainly geared towards securing sponsorship or intriguing or interesting literate elites. But the majority of practitioners ended up being, in many cases, illiterate or kind of more at the popular level. And there, the distinctions or the specific aspects of practice were perhaps less important.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, that's fascinating. I've got some follow-up questions, but I feel I should turn to the ones on the Slido first. And if we've got time, we normally go on for, so 7 or 8 more minutes, if that's okay with you. We have got, so there's a couple of anonymous ones came in. So maybe I'll read those out. They came in a while ago. First one, please, can you elaborate on the common you mentioned this, the common mislabel of agents as elements. You sort of implied that they do a bit more than sort of inert elements. They have some potency themselves, I suppose.
Yeah, so this is just, I mean, the way that it's been translated historically is the 5 elements, and I guess that's because of analogs in Europe and other places. But I want to bring up that slide. These are never ever static, and they're always in movement. And actually, I'm going to share the screen just for a second, so I can bring up the slide here. They're defined by their interactions between each other, and you have 2 major ways that they interact. One is generation, right? So one generates the other. So wood generates fire, for example, when you burn it, or things like that. And the other one is conquest. So you have a kind of productive or generative relationship, and then you have a antagonistic. I don't know why it's called support here. This is actually a mistake. It should be, it's not my slide, but it should be conquest. So metal will conquer wood because you use an axe to chop it. And they're always in flux and always in movement, so that's why they're called agents. Moreover, the Chinese character Xing, when we say wuxing, the 5 agents, Xing means to go or to move or to act. So it's a more accurate translation. It's not, there isn't like a very deep logic behind the translation, but that's what it is. Okay,
great, thanks. Yeah, it seems quite distinct in some ways from Indian traditions, but then some, I mean, more parallels perhaps with the doshas in the body of Ayurveda, constantly, moving and going out of balance. Maybe we'll now, if we could go to Dagmar, if that's possible, please. Dagmar Wujastic, I presume, that we were talking about before we got going. Is that going to work out? Is she still here?
Hopefully, I have asked her.
Maybe
I see her, but we can't hear you. Yeah. Okay, probably no microphone or.
Okay, if it doesn't work, I can read it out anyway. We can't hear you. Hi, hello, Dagmar. We can see you. We got you. It says, can you explain the idea of cinnabar fields in the context of the body as landscape? Does cinnabar, the substance, feature in the landscape body?
Oh, right. That's a very good question. No, it doesn't. Is the short answer. They're called cinnabar fields because, again, I stressed that the lower cinnabar field is in most cases the most important one, and that was the original cinnabar field. And there's a description that I also thought of putting up here, but basically it refers to the color of that field that it's supposed to have. So it's a deep red that is analogous to cinnabar, and that's why they call it a cinnabar field. And then that way of referring to that cinnabar field, which is red, got transferred over to the other 2, even though the other 2 aren't red or cinnabar colored.
Okay, great, thanks. And an anonymous one. Does the yin-yang concept come from Buddhism? And then in brackets, we have Luo scrolls, which I'm afraid doesn't mean anything to me. But maybe hopefully.
No, I don't know about the scrolls, but it definitely doesn't come from Buddhism. yin yang concept is, so Buddhism comes from India, and yin yang is indigenous to Chinese conception of the universe. And it's pretty old. It predates Daoism. I'm trying to think. It goes back at least to 500-600 BCE, if not earlier.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, I hadn't realized about the high level antagonism between Buddhism and Daoism. That's very interesting. Made me think also sort of Shaivism and Buddhism, you know, perhaps the courtly or theoretical level, and then what you were saying about at the ground level, people probably not caring too much.
No, and what's interesting is that you have a lot of currents of Daoism. When you have this formative period, they're taking a lot of cues from Buddhism. Buddhism is in a period of ascendancy, and so they just take over cosmology, practices, and put a very thin Daoist veneer on it. So if you look at the Daoist canon, there's a lot of texts that are basically Buddhist texts, just with Daoist terms inserted into them. So there's a lot of interaction too.
Thanks. Okay, one more anonymous. Will you please share the text or texts in which you find the liberating corpse, feigning corpse pose? And that sounded very interesting. Lots of Indian parallels as well.
Sure. Most of the descriptions of that practice come from hagiographies of immortals. So you don't have like a text that focuses specifically on it. But if you read Fabrizio's article, this one, let me put it up, which is the Daoist immortal body, this one right here. You have a good description of it, and he also points to some of the main sources of it. Otherwise, there's a very useful resource called the Encyclopedia of Daoism, published by Routledge, that is available in digital or hard copy formats. And there you have entries for all no problem. All of these major concepts or practices. So I highly recommend it. Encyclopedia of Daoism with a T. The Taoism.
Okay, I see. T for Daoism. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. We got Hector has a question. If we could go to him, please.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you, Dominic, Doctor. My question is about if you know that if there are some distinctions between yin and yang practices in any of the three bodies that maybe have survived throughout the times to nowadays and practice today, either in China or any other place in the world.
So wait, are you asking if the practices are still practiced nowadays, or if the distinction between?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
The two things. If there are distinctions between the three bodies, and if some of those practices have survived throughout the times.
Yes. So a lot of the internal alchemical practices are still, I guess, prevalent. People still practice them. And there's this thing also that I didn't get into, but a practice called Nudan, which is female alchemy that emerges in the 1800s, 1700s or 1800s. That is a female analog to the more kind of male-centered practices of internal alchemy. And both of these are still practiced. I mean, if you go to Daoist temples in China or elsewhere, you know, they're not going to practice it in front of you. They're not going to be super forthcoming either, but they'll say, oh yes, this is something that we do practice. But it's still kind of like a closed world when it comes to these specific types of practices that happen to be more esoteric and also more internal, so they're harder to manifest, right? But yes, a lot of these are still practiced, and you do have differences also between, you know, male and female practices. They're adapted.
Great, thanks. Well, with slightly over time, I've got about a dozen questions I could ask, which I'm not going to. But we have got one more. If you don't mind, we've got time to go to one more person. If you don't mind going over a couple of minutes to Caroline Gunning. Caroline, are you there? Can we?
Yeah, hold on. Hi.
Hello, Caroline.
So I can't share my video. Hi. My question was, hi, thank you, Dominic. It's really, really interesting. I'm a practitioner of Qigong, so listening to your talk, I was thinking whether the cinnabar field in any way related to the dantians that we find in Qigong, like the lower dantian, the middle dantian, the higher dantian, and you spoke about the sort of lower cinnabar field being of great importance, and that's the same with the dantians in Qigong, that the lower dantian is called the golden house, the powerhouse of the energy. So is there a link there between the two, or relationship?
So cinnabar field is a translation of dantian, so it's the same thing.
Oh, it is.
100% the same thing. Yeah. A lot of Qigong practices, so Qigong as a independent tradition emerges, many of the systems emerge post PRC, so after 1949, but they are grounded in earlier traditions that find their roots in Daoist meditations. So yeah, there's a definite straight connection. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Dominic. We're definitely going to have to continue this conversation. It's, over the years. I told you we've got plans afoot, but who knows what will come of them. But hopefully we can dive into this deeper. Great. And we've got to get you over in person. Third time lucky, it's going to happen.